You wake to the sound of steel being sharpened in the early darkness of the Tower of London. It is May 19th, 1536 AD. The steady scrape of whetstone against blade cuts through the mist like a funeral toll. Each stroke is deliberate, measured, final. You were once Queen of England. In less than 4 hours, that same blade will take your head. The cold stone walls around you seem to throb with the beat of your heart as you sit stiffly on the narrow bed. Your hands shake, not from the chill, but from the certainty of what awaits. Through the barred window, you hear carpenters hammering together the scaffold that will soon serve as your stage. Each strike of the mallet reverberates in your chest. It is a countdown that has been building for weeks. Your ladies-in-waiting move quietly through the chamber, pale and hollow-eyed, like shadows of the living. They dress you carefully in a gray damask gown with a white chemise beneath, colors chosen to symbolize mourning and purity. You cannot ignore the bitter irony. Henry has selected these clothes himself. Even now, he insists on controlling the story, presenting you as a sinner, humbled rather than a wife betrayed. The air within the tower is heavy with the familiar stench of river mud and human misery. But today, it carries something more. The metallic bite of fear, mingled with the sweet smoke drifting from the chapel where prayers are being offered for your soul. From beyond the door comes the sound of footsteps, voices, and the clink of armor as guards take their places. The machinery of death is already turning, and you are the centerpiece of this grim performance. Before we go deeper into this story of suffering and survival, if you enjoy discovering the hidden truths of history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more content like this. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'm always struck by the thought that we're piecing together these centuries-old events from every corner of the world, linked by our shared fascination with the past. Anne Boleyn's nightmare did not begin with treason or adultery, but with Henry VIII's desperate hunger for a male heir and his growing fixation on Jane Seymour. By January 1536 AD, Anne had suffered another miscarriage. This one was especially cruel, happening on the very day Henry was thrown from his horse during a joust and left unconscious for 2 hours. To those at court, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. As the king hovered between life and death, so too did Anne's hopes of securing her place through motherhood. The lost child was said to have been a boy, a detail that would haunt her final days. Henry, who had broken from Rome and torn England apart to make her queen, now whispered that their marriage was cursed. The same arguments he once used to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon were now turned against Anne. The irony was vicious. The reasoning that had raised her up would now be the weapon to cast her down. But Henry required more than whispers of divine judgment. He needed legal grounds, ones that would not discredit his own decisions or threaten the legitimacy of their daughter, Elizabeth. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, understood this all too well. His survival depended on reading the king's will before it was spoken. He began weaving a case so intricate and damning that it would not only destroy Anne, but erase any sympathy for her. The first thread he pulled was her rumored closeness with the court musician, Mark Smeaton. Smeaton was everything Henry was not: young, slender, dark-haired, and blessed with an easy charm that made him popular among the ladies. On April 30th, 1536 AD, Cromwell had Smeaton arrested and taken to his house in Stepney. There, he was interrogated. No official record describes what methods were used, but the likelihood of torture is almost certain. What we know for certain is this: Mark Smeaton, who at first denied any improper connection with the Queen, left Cromwell's questioning ready to confess, not only to adultery with Anne, but with vivid details that became the foundation of the case against her. The timing and the nature of that confession point to a man broken under torment, saying whatever was necessary to end his suffering. With Smeaton's testimony secured, Cromwell moved quickly to spin a wider net of supposed conspirators. On May 1st, during the May Day festivities at Greenwich Palace, Henry Norris, the King's Groom of the Stool, and one of his closest friends, was suddenly arrested. The cruel irony of seizing Norris during a celebration of spring and renewal was impossible to ignore. It felt as though Cromwell intended to taint even the happiest symbols with poison. Norris had served Henry for more than a decade, enjoying both trust and intimacy with the king. His alleged crime was not only adultery with Anne, but high treason, the ultimate betrayal of the man who had raised him from a minor gentleman to a figure of immense influence. Questioned about his role, Norris firmly insisted on his innocence, showing either the strength of truth or the grim knowledge that a confession meant certain death. William Brereton was taken next, on May 4th. He was a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, a man whose Welsh roots and modest standing meant his position at court depended entirely on royal favor. Like Norris, he was accused of adultery with Anne, but Cromwell added another layer, an accusation of plotting the king's murder, supposedly so that Anne could marry one of her lovers and rule through a pliable husband. The most startling arrest followed on May 5th. Sir Francis Weston, barely 25 years old and newly married, was sent to the Tower. Coming from a wealthy family, he had no reason to risk his fortune or his life for Anne. To many observers, his inclusion in the plot seemed absurd. With youth, wealth, and a secure future ahead of him, why would he gamble at all? Yet, in Cromwell's narrative, even Weston became a willing traitor. But the most devastating blow came earlier, on May 2nd, when George Boleyn, Anne's younger brother, and Viscount Rochford, was charged with incest. The accusation was monstrous, so vile that it stripped away any possibility of pity. By branding Anne not only as unfaithful, but as corrupted beyond nature itself, Cromwell ensured that no punishment could seem too harsh. George Boleyn, like his sister, was intelligent, cultured, and sharp-tongued, a man admired and feared at court. Above all, he was loyal to Anne, and that loyalty itself threatened Henry's authority. By accusing George, Cromwell wasn't only targeting a brother, he was silencing anyone who might dare defend Anne, for to do so would appear to support an unspeakable crime. All of these arrests, 5 men in just 5 days, show the precision of Cromwell's plan. This was no gradual uncovering of scandal. It was a carefully timed assault, designed to crush Anne's supporters before they could react. Anne herself was seized on May the 2nd, immediately after returning from a tennis match at Greenwich Palace. There, she had watched Henry play with Francis Weston, the same man who, 3 days later, would be accused as her lover. The symbolism was calculated and cruel. Her last glimpse of freedom was bound to the same figure who would be named as her betrayer. The charges were read to Anne by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, a man who had once benefited from the Boleyn family's rise, now stood as the herald of her downfall. His role in condemning her showed the cold arithmetic of Tudor politics, where survival and ambition outweighed family loyalty, and betrayal was often the surest path to power. Family loyalty meant little when compared to royal favor and the need for survival. Accounts from witnesses show Anne's initial response to the charges: disbelief mixed with grim humor. When first told she was accused of adultery, she laughed, not out of joy, but because the very idea was absurd. The notion that a queen, constantly surrounded by attendants and watched at every turn, could secretly carry on multiple affairs was so ridiculous that laughter seemed her only possible reaction. But as the charges grew heavier, adultery with 5 men, incest with her own brother, conspiring to murder the king, and plotting to remarry after Henry's death, her laughter vanished. These were not accusations of simple misconduct. They were accusations of treason that struck at the very foundation of her crown, her marriage, and her place in the realm. Her journey from Greenwich Palace to the Tower of London was filled with cruel symbolism. Just 3 years earlier, she had traveled the same route in triumph during her coronation, with cheering crowds and flowers showered upon her. Now, she passed silently in a guarded barge, the people watching in mute astonishment as the once celebrated queen moved toward her downfall. Upon her arrival, she was confined in the same royal apartments she had occupied before her coronation. The rooms still held the rich furnishings and tapestries of her glory days, now turned into her gilded prison. The choice was deliberate, designed to remind her of how far she had fallen. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, was ordered to keep a close record of her words and conduct. Kingston, ever the cautious bureaucrat, knew his survival depended on providing his superiors with the information they wanted. His reports describe a woman shifting between composure and despair. At times, Anne carried herself with the dignity of a queen, insisting on her innocence. At other times, she broke down under the weight of her situation. One striking detail in Kingston's notes is Anne's continuing belief that Henry would spare her. She repeated her conviction that he would never execute the mother of his child, that their history together would protect her. This shows either a deep misunderstanding of the man she had married, or a refusal to accept the terrifying truth. The trials of the accused men began on May 12th, 1536 AD, in Westminster Hall. The proceedings were less about justice and more about performance. Their purpose was to create the appearance of legality for what was, in reality, a political purge. The evidence was thin, built on circumstantial moments, small gifts from Anne, words exchanged in passing, or their presence at events where misconduct could supposedly have taken place. Mark Smeaton's confession remained the centerpiece of the case, yet even that was fraught with doubt. He was of humble birth, a musician whose entire livelihood depended on court favor. The idea that he would risk everything for an affair with the Queen stretched belief, especially since the penalty for such an act was death. Still, under the shadow of torture, his testimony became the cornerstone of the conspiracy. Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston each declared their innocence. They refused to confess, even when promised the possibility of lighter sentences in return. Their refusal to yield, even with death certain, points to either extraordinary courage or true innocence, or perhaps both. These were men with everything to live for and nothing to gain by protecting a queen who was already marked for death. The separate trial of George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, proved to be the most dramatic of all. George was a gifted speaker and sharp legal thinker, and he chose to defend himself. His performance in Westminster Hall was so persuasive that many in the audience felt the jury was unsettled, even swayed by his words. For a fleeting moment, it seemed possible that at least one of Anne's supposed conspirators might escape Cromwell's net. But George made a fatal mistake, whether from inexperience in court politics or a reckless wish to clear his sister's name. He was handed a written question, one he had been instructed to read silently. Instead, he read it aloud to the court. The question implied that Henry was impotent, unable to satisfy Anne as a husband. The mere suggestion of such a failing was catastrophic. The king's reputation had been wounded in public, and George's fate was sealed instantly. Guilt or innocence no longer mattered. The verdicts were never in doubt. Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and Mark Smeaton were all found guilty and sentenced to the brutal punishment reserved for traitors, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. George Boleyn, because of his noble birth, was sentenced to beheading. The swiftness of the trials and the sameness of the judgments made it plain. This was about politics, not justice. Henry's handling of the condemned showed his cold calculation. He commuted the sentences of the 4 commoners to simple beheading, trumpeting it as an act of royal mercy. In truth, it was a tactic to avoid the spectacle of mutilation, which might have stirred sympathy for the accused. On May 17th, 1536 AD, the 5 men were executed on Tower Hill. Mark Smeaton, the musician whose confession had ignited the entire case, went to his death repeating his guilt. Whether that was born of true shame, a desperate attempt to shield others, or simply the broken mind of a man crushed by torture, we cannot know. Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston all declared their innocence until the very end. Their final words, carefully recorded by onlookers, showed a dignity that gave weight to their claims. George Boleyn's execution was perhaps the most moving. As Anne's brother and closest ally, his death was not only a personal tragedy but a devastating blow to the family that had once stood at the height of power. His last speech, eloquent and composed, was marked by steadfast claims of innocence and carried the same brilliance that had once made him indispensable at court. Anne, confined to her rooms in the tower, could not escape the sounds of their deaths. She would have heard the swelling crowd, the thud of the axe, and the roar of voices as the executions were carried out. The torment of knowing that these men, friends, allies, and her own brother, had died because of her, whether through truth or lies, must have been unbearable. Meanwhile, Henry had already shifted his gaze. Even before Anne's trial had begun, he was preparing for marriage to Jane Seymour, where Anne was dark, magnetic, and intellectually challenging. Jane was pale, obedient, and content to embody the image of a quiet, submissive wife. To Henry, Jane represented not only personal comfort, but political stability, the perfect contrast to the woman he was about to destroy. Anne's own trial was scheduled for May 15th, 1536 AD, to be held in the Great Hall of the Tower of London itself. The location carried deliberate meaning. By holding the proceedings inside the tower, Henry avoided the possibility of public sympathy spilling into the streets, while surrounding Anne with the grim walls of the fortress that now held her captive. The trial was pure Tudor theater, a spectacle of law and pageantry. Anne entered the hall, dressed in black, the color of mourning, a stark, visible reminder of her fall from royal grace. She was attended by her ladies-in-waiting, who remained by her side both to comfort her and to serve as witnesses, ensuring that her every word and gesture would be carefully observed and reported. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, and Anne's own uncle, presided over the trial as Lord High Steward. The sight of Norfolk pronouncing judgment on his niece was perhaps the clearest display of the ruthless reality of Tudor politics, where survival and royal favor always outweighed blood and loyalty. The charges were read in full, each more damning than the last. Anne was accused of committing adultery with Henry Norris on October 6, 1533 AD, at Westminster Palace, with William Brereton on November 8, 1533 AD, at Westminster, with Mark Smeaton on April 26, 1536 AD, at Westminster, and with Francis Weston on May 20th, 1534 AD, at Westminster Palace. The precision of these dates and locations was designed to make the accusations appear credible, yet the very neatness of the details betrayed their invention. They were too exact, too convenient for prosecutors, desperate to make their case airtight. The charge of incest with her brother, George Boleyn, was dated to November 2nd, 1535 AD, at Westminster Palace, months after Anne's last pregnancy had ended in miscarriage. The implication was not sudden passion, but deliberate conspiracy. It fit neatly into Cromwell's narrative of a queen so depraved that no crime was beyond her. The most serious charge of all was treason, that Anne had conspired to imagine and plan the death of the king, and had promised to wed one of her lovers once Henry was gone. Without this accusation, her supposed crimes might have been seen as personal sins. With it, they became a direct threat to the stability of the crown and the realm, an offense punishable only by death. Witnesses recorded Anne's demeanor closely. She held herself with composure throughout the reading of the charges, her face calm and regal, betraying nothing of her inner torment. When allowed to speak, she denied every accusation firmly, her voice steady enough to impress even those who despised her. But Anne's defense was hobbled from the start. As a woman, a subject and the defendant, she had almost no rights. She could not summon witnesses to speak for her, could not cross-examine her accusers, and had no legal counsel to argue on her behalf. The trial had been designed not to test her guilt, but to confirm it. The evidence was weak, built mostly on gossip and insinuation. Servants and courtiers offered vague accounts of suspicious glances, private conversations, or gifts exchanged between Anne and the accused men. The prosecution leaned heavily on rumor, weaving innuendo into a case meant to appear solid. One of the most damaging claims came from Lady Wingfield. Dead by the time of the trial, she could not be questioned, yet others testified that she had, before her death, confided knowledge of Anne's misconduct. The details of this alleged knowledge were never made clear, but the very fact that a deceased witness's words were accepted as evidence revealed the desperation of Cromwell's prosecution. The speed of the proceedings was astonishing, even by Tudor standards. The entire trial, presentation of evidence, debate, and verdict was completed in a single day. There was no time for careful consideration, no opportunity for Anne to mount a meaningful defense. The rush underscored Henry's urgency. He wanted to rid himself of Anne, clear the path for marriage to Jane Seymour, and prevent public opinion from rallying in the fallen queen's favor. When the jury withdrew to deliberate, there was little suspense about the verdict. The 26 peers who sat in judgment were men whose power and titles depended on Henry's favor, and they understood that their own survival required delivering the outcome the king demanded. Among them were former allies of Anne, who, to preserve themselves, now condemned her. The verdict was delivered by Norfolk, her uncle, with what witnesses described as visible emotion. Whether this was true sorrow or simply relief at completing a grim duty remains uncertain. For Norfolk, the situation was especially cruel. He was required to preside over the destruction of his own niece, all while keeping up the pretense that justice had been done. The sentence was death, by burning or beheading, at the king's discretion. Burning had long been the medieval punishment for women guilty of treason, particularly those accused of adultery. Beheading was offered as a supposed mercy, though it also spared Henry the gruesome spectacle of a queen burned alive before the public. Anne's reaction was carefully noted. She received her condemnation with striking composure, holding her dignity as queen even in the face of death. She declared her innocence and prayed for God to save the king, her voice echoing through the great hall of the Tower with a clarity that moved even those who wished her gone. Yet her private moments, recorded by Sir William Kingston and her attending ladies, revealed the torment beneath. In the days between trial and execution, Anne swung between hope and despair. At times, she convinced herself Henry would spare her, clinging to the memory of their past love, and believing that it must still count for something. In hindsight, this faith appears almost tragic. Knowing Henry's character and how he treated other wives who lost his favor, mercy was never likely. Her inability to accept reality may have been a desperate defense mechanism to preserve her sanity under unbearable pressure. The question of Anne's actual guilt has haunted historians. For nearly 5 centuries, the case against her was weak, built on circumstantial evidence, and the testimony of courtiers whose survival depended on Cromwell and the king. Mark Smeaton's confession, extracted under torture, was the linchpin, but confessions under such conditions were unreliable, even by Tudor standards. The charges themselves collapsed under scrutiny. Court records show that at several of the times, Anne was accused of affairs. She was either pregnant or recovering from childbirth, circumstances that made the accusations highly implausible. Beyond that, the daily scrutiny of a queen's life made it nearly impossible for her to conduct secret relationships without discovery. The sheer speed with which charges were drawn up and trials completed suggests the outcome was predetermined. Cromwell's efficiency in building the case was remarkable, but it looks less like an investigation than a carefully staged removal. Perhaps the most telling fact is that none of Anne's alleged lovers, except the tortured Smeaton, confessed to any wrongdoing, even when the promise of a lighter sentence might have spared them. Facing certain death, they had every incentive to yield, yet all went to the block proclaiming their innocence. The political reality of 1536 AD also speaks volumes. Henry's desperation for a male heir had reached crisis, and his courtship of Jane Seymour was already underway. Anne's miscarriage in January 1536 ended her usefulness to the king, transforming her from asset to obstacle. Henry's past showed he would destroy anyone who blocked his desires. He had broken with Rome to marry Anne, and now he was prepared to destroy her just as ruthlessly. Yet the debate over Anne's guilt extends beyond legal charges to her character. Contemporary accounts paint her as intelligent, ambitious, and politically sharp, but also proud, sharp-tongued, and vengeful toward rivals. Her treatment of Catherine of Aragon and Princess Mary earned her bitter enemies who welcomed her downfall. The same wit and boldness that first captivated Henry may have later fueled his resentment as Anne became increasingly willing to challenge his authority. Her closeness with her brother, George Boleyn, also fueled gossip. Though the incest charge had no credible evidence, their intense loyalty to each other, natural in a family that had risen together in a dangerous court, was twisted into suspicion by those eager to believe the worst. As Anne awaited her fate in the Tower, Henry was already moving forward, preparing for his marriage to Jane Seymour. On May 14th, the day before Anne's trial, Archbishop Cranmer was summoned to Lambeth Palace to hear Henry's confession and to declare his marriage to Anne null and void. The speed of this action revealed Henry's determination to remove every legal barrier to his marriage with Jane Seymour. The annulment rested on the same theological reasoning Henry had once used to dissolve his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, that the union had never been valid in the eyes of God. This time, Henry argued that his earlier relationship with Anne's sister Mary created an impediment that rendered his marriage to Anne incestuous and invalid from the start. The irony was striking. On one hand, Anne was accused of adultery within the marriage. On the other, Henry claimed there had never been a marriage at all. The contradiction did not matter. What mattered was convenience. By declaring the marriage invalid, Henry erased Anne's queenship and declared their daughter Elizabeth illegitimate. For Anne, the psychological blow must have been crushing. In an instant, she was stripped not only of her crown, but of her very identity as Queen of England. She was reduced to a woman accused of living in sin with the king, her daughter branded a bastard, and her life's work dismissed as nothing. Meanwhile, preparations for her execution moved forward with grim Tudor efficiency. Henry had made an unusual decision. Instead of the traditional English axe, he ordered a skilled swordsman from Calais. This was presented as an act of mercy, since the French method was faster and more precise. But the choice served other purposes as well. It distanced Henry personally from the deed, framed the execution as a matter of formal justice rather than vengeance, and avoided relying on an English executioner who might falter or hesitate. The man brought from Calais was described as a professional, one who had carried out similar duties for the French court. His reputation lent an air of sophistication, as if Anne's death were being conducted with the same standards of refinement seen abroad. Even the sword itself became a subject of fearful fascination. Unlike the heavy English axe, it was light, sharp, and designed for precision. Hidden from view, until the final moment, it carried an unsettling air of mystery that only deepened the tension surrounding her fate. Anne's behavior in her last days reflected both her strength and her suffering. Sir William Kingston reported her moods shifting between confidence and despair, sometimes calm and defiant, other times overcome with tears. She spoke often of her innocence and of her faith that God would defend her, but at the same time, she made practical preparations for her death, a sign that she knew the end was close. Her greatest concern was for her daughter, Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old. Anne knew the child would now be left without her mother and branded illegitimate. Her repeated pleas to see Elizabeth one last time were denied, a final act of cruelty that weighed heavily on her spirit. Through it all, Anne was attended by her ladies-in-waiting. These women, once proud to serve a reigning queen, were now witnesses to her downfall. They offered comfort, but also acted as observers, tasked with reporting her words and behavior to the authorities. Their position was agonizing: to remain loyal to Anne while protecting their own standing at court. On the night before her execution, Anne prayed for hours, preparing her soul for judgment. Accounts describe her as calm, composed, and resigned, finally accepting that Henry would never spare her. She also discussed practical details with her ladies: what clothes she would wear, how she should carry herself, and how she must meet death with dignity. Even at the end, Anne understood she was on display, that her final moments would be remembered and interpreted as either guilt, innocence, or defiance. At last, the morning of May 19th, 1536, A.D. arrived. The day began gray and damp, the mist over the Tower of London mirroring the heavy silence that had settled on all who waited for the Queen's final hour. Anne rose early on May 19th, having slept little during her final night. She began at once the rituals of preparation for death. She chose a dark gray damask gown with a white chemise beneath, colors that spoke of mourning and purity. The symbolism was deliberate. The white suggested innocence, while the gray reflected her acceptance of the fate that awaited her. Her hair, once her most striking feature, and the charm that had first captivated Henry, was arranged simply and covered with a white coif, making the executioner's work easier. Even in these small details, the practical necessities of execution shaped her appearance, reminding Anne that she was no longer preparing for a courtly event, but for her death. Her final meal was modest, a little bread and wine. She ate not out of hunger, but for the ritual meaning, as if sharing one last communion with life before surrendering it. Outside her windows, the sounds of preparation grew louder as morning advanced. Workmen tested the scaffold, built in the night, laying straw to absorb the blood that would soon be spilled. The arrangements were carried out with the same cold efficiency that defined Tudor administration. Crowds began to gather early. Public executions were common entertainment in Tudor England, but never before had a crowned queen been sentenced to die. The Tower Green filled quickly. Courtiers who had once courted her favor, merchants who had profited from her patronage, commoners drawn by curiosity or duty, and others who came for the grim satisfaction of witnessing a queen's destruction. At last, Sir William Kingston, constable of the Tower, entered Anne's chambers with formal notification that her time had come. His manner was respectful, but unyielding. He was escorting not only a queen, but a condemned traitor to her lawful end. Anne's reply was calm and deliberate. Rising from her chair, she straightened her gown and declared herself ready. No tears, no hysteria, only the poise that had marked her imprisonment from the start. The walk from her apartments to the scaffold was the longest journey she would ever take. Each step carried her away from the living and closer to eternity. She passed through the same courtyards where she had once walked in triumph, where subjects had bowed before her as queen. The same walls that had echoed with the noise of celebration now stood silent witnesses to her ruin. The tower that had once been her palace during the days of her coronation was now the stage for her destruction. As Anne stepped onto Tower Green, the crowd hushed. The sight was too extraordinary, too unprecedented. Here was a woman who had once been the most powerful figure in England after the king himself, now stripped of all status and walking with measured steps toward her death. The scaffold stood simple, a wooden platform raised only a few feet above the ground. Unlike the towering structures used for male traders, Anne's was built low, designed not for grand spectacle, but for sober intimacy, perhaps a final nod to her former queenship. Upon the platform, the foreign executioner already waited. Dressed in unfamiliar clothing and wearing a black hood, he stood as a dark and enigmatic figure. His very presence was a reminder that Anne's death would be unlike any other execution England had seen. The executioner stood silently beside the block where Anne would soon kneel, his sword hidden beneath a covering of straw so that no one could glimpse it too soon. Anne walked steadily up the scaffold, supported by her ladies who had been granted the right to remain with her until the end. Once she reached the platform, she turned to face the waiting crowd. As custom demanded of all condemned traitors, she prepared to give her final speech. Different witnesses recorded slightly different versions of her words, but their meaning was the same. Anne spoke of her loyalty to the king and accepted the judgment that had been placed upon her. She asked the people to pray for her soul and expressed her hope that God would show her mercy in the world to come. What stood out most was what she did not say. Anne never openly declared her innocence, nor did she speak against Henry or the court that had sentenced her. Historians have long debated this silence. Was it true acceptance of her fate? A careful act to protect her daughter Elizabeth's future? Or simply the exhaustion of a woman drained by fear, grief, and endless waiting? When her words were finished, Anne began to remove the symbols of her queenship. She took off her headdress and jewelry and handed them carefully to her ladies. The gesture was both practical and deeply symbolic, the final stripping away of her identity as queen. She was preparing to meet death, not as royalty, but as Anne Boleyn. Her ladies then tied a white cloth over her eyes. The blindfold spared her the sight of the sword, and it also served a grimly practical purpose. It would help keep her head steady so that the blow would be quick and clean. Anne knelt gracefully beside the low block prepared for her. Her back was straight, her bearing regal, her composure intact. Even in her last moments, she seemed acutely aware of the image she would leave to history. At last, the executioner stepped forward. With quiet movements, he revealed his weapon. It was not the heavy English axe, but a long, slim sword brought from Calais. Crafted for precision, it was meant to end life in a single stroke. Its foreignness added an uncanny weight to the moment, marking Anne's death as unlike any other execution in England's history. Then came the moment that would be remembered and studied for centuries. In one swift motion, almost too quick for the eye to follow, the executioner lifted his sword and struck. Anne Boleyn's head was severed cleanly in a single blow. For a breathless instant, there was silence. The crowd stood stunned, unable to absorb the enormity of what had just happened. The execution of a queen. Then came gasps, whispered prayers, and low murmurs of disbelief. Some crossed themselves, muttering words for Anne's soul. Others simply stared, frozen by the reality that one moment she had been alive, and the next she was gone, reduced to a lifeless body lying upon the scaffold. The foreign executioner's skill was both a mercy and a horror. His precision spared Anne the drawn-out torment that so often accompanied the axe, yet the swiftness of her end made the finality all the more shocking. Her ladies, their faces wet with tears, stepped forward at once. With tenderness and care, they gathered Anne's head and body, wrapping them in white cloth, as though preparing her for rest. Their grief was raw and sincere. They had stood beside her in her triumphs, and they remained with her in her darkest hour, offering her the last service they could give. The crowd began to break apart almost as soon as Anne's head had fallen. It was as though the spectators could no longer bear the weight of what they had just seen. The execution of a crowned Queen of England was unprecedented, and many left Tower Green with the uneasy feeling that they had witnessed something that shook the very foundations of monarchy and divine right. Henry VIII wasted no time in turning the page. Within hours of Anne's death, his thoughts and actions had already shifted toward the future. On May 30th, 1536, AD, just 11 days later, he secretly married Jane Seymour. The haste revealed his determination to bury Anne's memory and begin fresh with a wife he believed would be more obedient and less confrontational than the one he had destroyed. Yet Henry's effort to erase Anne entirely was never fully successful. Though declared illegitimate, her daughter Elizabeth survived, and in time would rise to become one of England's greatest rulers. The irony was undeniable. The Queen Henry had executed in his obsession with a male heir would be remembered through the very daughter he had disowned. The men executed alongside Anne quickly faded into near obscurity, remembered only because of their association with her downfall. Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and George Boleyn were sacrificed to Henry's determination to sever ties with his second marriage. Their deaths stood as a grim warning to anyone who might dare to oppose royal power or be drawn too closely into the orbit of a doomed favorite. Thomas Cromwell, the master planner behind Anne's destruction, remained in Henry's favor for a time, continuing to shape policy until his own sudden fall and execution in 1540 AD. His fate underscored a brutal truth about Henry's court. No servant, however useful, was safe once he ceased to serve the king's immediate needs. Questions about Anne's guilt or innocence never fully disappeared. Archbishop Cranmer, who had been forced to annul her marriage, later confided private doubts about whether justice had been done. Others, like her uncle the Duke of Norfolk, maintained a public defense of the verdict, though it is likely that even he wrestled with the shame of condemning his own niece. The consequences of Anne's death extended far beyond her own life. Her execution set a precedent that shaped Henry's later treatment of his wives and deepened the climate of fear that would hang over his court. The young king who had once been praised as a Renaissance prince, cultured, moderate, even promising, now revealed himself as a monarch capable of extraordinary cruelty when his desires were threatened. Abroad, the reaction was one of horror. The courts of Europe, already scandalized by Henry's break with Rome, now viewed him as a tyrant who had murdered his queen to satisfy his lust for another woman. England's reputation suffered. Its isolation from Catholic Europe deepened. Yet beneath all the politics and diplomacy, the human cost of Anne's fall remained the most haunting reality. A woman who had once stood second only to the king in power had been reduced to a headless body on a scaffold, destroyed by her husband's ambition, insecurity, and ruthless will. Anne's burial reflected the same cold efficiency that had defined her trial and execution. There was no grand funeral, no ceremony befitting a former queen. Her remains were placed unceremoniously in an old elm chest, once used to store bow staves, and interred in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower walls. The irony was bitter. She was laid to rest alongside others, condemned as traitors, including her brother George, and the very men executed as her supposed lovers. That small chapel became, in time, a resting place for the many who had fallen from Henry's grace, a quiet monument to the peril of living too near absolute power. In the days that followed, court life resumed, almost as if nothing had happened. The swiftness with which normal routines resumed struck many as obscene in its coldness. The queen who had been so central to England's life and politics had been erased in a matter of days, her memory deliberately buried with her body. Courtiers, who had once fought for Anne's attention, quickly redirected their loyalty toward Jane Seymour. The machinery of government kept turning as though nothing unusual had happened, as if the execution of a queen were simply another matter dealt with by Tudor efficiency. Yet beneath this surface normality, the shock of Anne's destruction lingered. Those who had stood on Tower Green carried with them the image of that swift, decisive stroke. The sword flashing in the morning light, the blindfolded queen kneeling with dignity until the very end. That memory would haunt them for the rest of their lives. What Henry himself felt in the aftermath remains one of history's enduring questions. Contemporary sources report no sign of remorse. Outwardly, he threw himself into his new marriage with enthusiasm, but the speed with which he set about erasing Anne from the royal record suggests something more complex. Perhaps guilt, or at least a desperate desire to escape the shadow of what he had done. Her portraits were taken down from royal palaces. Her initials, once proudly carved into stone, were hacked away. Her coat of arms was replaced with Jane Seymour's. The purge was deliberate and thorough, as if Henry believed that by removing all trace of Anne's existence, he could undo this reality of her life and her death. Yet history rarely obeys the wishes of kings. Anne's story endured, not just in official documents, but in the memories of those who had known her, in the whispered recollections of courtiers, and in the growing legend of a woman who had defied the established order and paid the highest price for her defiance. Anne Boleyn's execution marked a decisive turning point in Henry VIII's reign and in England's history. It proved that royal power could reach even into the king's own household, destroying wives, relatives, and loyal servants without hesitation. It set precedents that would shape how later queens and political rivals were treated. The woman who had once wielded enough influence to change England's religious direction was reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition and the shifting winds of royal favor. As May 19th, 1536 AD drew to a close, the Tower of London fell into silence. The scaffold was dismantled, the crowd gone, the blood-soaked straw cleared away. The queen who had risen so high and fallen so far now lay buried in obscurity. But the political and psychological aftershocks of her execution would echo for generations. That morning she had risen to the sound of steel being sharpened. By evening, that steel had done its work with brutal precision. The voice that once commanded the ear of a king and shaped the destiny of a nation had been silenced forever. In the gathering darkness, as the guards patrolled the walls and the Thames lapped against the fortress stones, the ghost of Anne Boleyn began its long haunting of English history. Though Henry tried to erase her, Anne lived on, in the private recollections of those who had seen her die, in the doubts of historians who questioned her guilt, and in the legend of a queen who dared to challenge her king and lost her life for it. The sound of steel marked the start of her final day. The heavy silence that followed her execution marked the end of one of the most dramatic and tragic chapters in the long, bloody history of the English crown. And within that silence lay the true horror of Anne Boleyn's death, not only the loss of a woman, but the destruction of possibility. the erasure of a different future, and the triumph of fear over hope in the treacherous world of Tudor England.